that now appears in the hair. But,
Yeah, and I think the voice work in that area is really pretty solid, and I think has been not challenged by very many people as something quite credible. What happened to the wireless mic? Russell, did you take that away?
Okay.
Oh, yeah, why don't you got it?
What
What are you doing, Mark?
I'm trying to pass it around for questions.
Let them yell.
Here, give us the mic. Keep jumping up and down.
Gil has done a lot of work on that and very convincing, I do believe. And there are others who have done a lot of work on that. And there are several resources that you can find. I think some of them on your website. and also some things that John Jackson has done that he's distributed.
Yes, I'm not an expert in this route at all. I became interested in it about 5 years ago. I am interested in finding out how much money has been spent. I mean, that's just
Personally or what?
Billions.
yeah. Where's the money come from? I mean, who's spent it?
Most of us are out of pocket untold sums of money.
Most of us are out of pocket untold sums of money. This is not just a hobby, it's an avocation, if you will. And before we went to Italy, the Durant's Foundation gave us hundreds of thousands. I don't remember the exact total.
Under about 100.
Okay, and then we had donations of upwards of $1 million worth of equipment.
From National Geographic.
Yes, $2,500.
That's all.
Yeah.
Geographic gave us $2,500.
We had initially some donations from National Geographic and the Durant's Foundation. I think maybe if I took a wild guess at the onset of 1978 expedition, maybe there was $150,000 associated. Now that doesn't include all the money that was spent. If you want to translate time into money by the various people preparing for all the work that's been done subsequently to that. By the way, I want to say that the appearance of logos in any of these geographs doesn't necessarily suggest institutional endorsement of this. Service trouble.
Let me toss out one of the anecdotes that Joe was referring to. I think when we left, they had airfare for all of us. They did not have coverage for the hotel. We were all told to bring our plastic with us because we may have to pay our way out of the hotel. At the last minute, is the Durant Foundation the Harry Johns?
Harry Johns.
Yeah, okay. At the last minute, they stepped in and paid the hotel bills. But this whole thing, you know, I was an agnostic at the time. I billed myself as an agnostic with my antenna up. But so many things happened to make this all come together that I tell you, it was awful hard to be an agnostic back then.
Okay, one more quick anecdote. When I was about to do this, I didn't have any money to take with me to Jordan, so I went to my banker. And of course, I'm Jewish, as most everybody knows. And I went to my banker and I said, listen, I'm going to Italy and I'm going to go examine this piece of cloth. And he looked at me and said, and I said, well, I need to borrow $1,000 because I'm broke and I don't have any money to go with it. And he looked at me and he said, what piece of cloth is this? And I said, well, it's called the Shroud of Turin. Well, he'd never heard of that. And finally, I sat there with the guy for about a half hour, and I can be reasonably convincing, remembering what my initials are. And eventually he looked me right in the eye and he says, well, I don't know anything about that. He says, but I'll loan you $1,000. And that was the money I took with me to Italy and was never reimbursed. I just had to pay it back. So when people talk about what Sturp did, there was a lot of out-of-pockets. There was a lot of personal effort. And remember, this didn't start when we went to Italy. This started almost 2 years before we went to Italy. A lot of our time flying around to meetings, stuff like that. All that was at our own expense.
There was one other thing. Several of us started early on giving talks. And Sturp had little envelopes that you could pass out at the talks. And funds were raised through that way because at one point, Tom DiMahalo, who was then the head of Sturp, was keeping track of who was doing the best talks financially. And I ended up kind of talking to Harry John of the Durant's Corporation because he thought I was getting the most return.
I just kept them on, so I
Yeah, I tell you, it's like most church work. I'm going to become a deacon so I can be rich.
Can I say, here's a couple other things. I mean, my impression, just looking at the landscape, is that most of the research since has really been done by individuals sort of out of their homes or garages. I mean, I don't get a sense there's been a lot of institutional involvement by universities, corporations, churches, just individuals. Frederick Zugibe doing all these experiments, the crucifixion out of his home, and Gilbert Lavoie doing experiments out of his home. I mean, I get the sense that, subsequently, it's really been a grassroots thing that's been done by committed individuals, not really endorsed by organizations at all.
I think that's a fair comment. I would say that, for example, going back to 1978, I was in the Air Force at the time, and I did it all on my own time. However, I will say that the Air Force was gracious enough to loan us the equipment. I had to sign my life away to take it to Italy, but there were lots of contributions like that that were very difficult to quantify.
Yes.
So if I had to set a number to all of this since 1970, the last 30 years or so, it's probably approaches $5 million in terms of effort, or maybe even more in terms of effort and equipment and other forms.
I get the impression that the foreign activity is financed differently than what we're talking about in the United States.
That's possible. I don't know. Anybody want to comment?
Well, remember that the shroud is in the control of the custodians of the shroud and Turin, which is now legally owned by the church, or the living pope, is the way the will of King Umberto said. So I think their resources are a lot better than a group of individuals from the United States who put their heads together to do this, and everybody thought we were crazy in the first place. So I don't know that there's ever been any substantial institutional involvement in the examination of the shroud from our
In
point.
France, the etude is financially backed by the government.
There's a government backing there, but the best that I can say from government backing is the fact that the people who were from Los Alamos and Sandia and Air Force Weapons Lab didn't get fired. So I mean, that was sort of their.
That was good.
That was a good thing.
Thanks to the now notorious carbon-14 dating, it's been very difficult to do, for example, even what Joe accomplished here in this conference, to get university support and things like that. I've been working because my initial publishing contract was through people tied to Duquesne University. There are other people that are connected to other universities. What we really need would be that type of ongoing place of support where we could hold conferences and so forth. And some of us have been talking about just trying to establish that kind of thing, maybe with a nonprofit, maybe with a museum, etc., so that our various collections after we're gone would have a place of residency where ongoing research can happen.
I will make another comment about institutional involvement. In many cases, for example, at universities, when you achieve a certain status, or for example, at maybe even the government laboratories, they pretty well let you do what you want if you get senior enough. So there's that level of, I won't call it institutional support, but it's sort of institutional, shrug your shoulders and say, well, this person is a very senior scientist and he has earned the right to do the sorts of research that he has to do. And so in many cases, I would say that was, I think it was a case of Ray's case, that he was a fellow, and when you reach that status, you just do what you want to do.
As a matter of fact, I might say that make sure you're here tomorrow. You'll see another example of that. Cryptic.
Okay, we've gone into the lunch period. This is so interesting. I'd rather hear this than eat personally, but
Speak for yourself.
I guess we got a couple options. I have to check to see if the food's actually out there. It's supposed to be starting at 12. Does anybody know if it's there?
It's there.
Okay.
It's there.
If you'd like, people could go get their food. We can keep going with this. You can bring your food back in.
Works for me.
And the panel could leave and get their food.
I have an answer for etc. It is very interesting the image of the phase obtained in the band between 8 to 14 micrometers. image, for me at least, it is quite difficult, quite different from the image of the face in the visible light. In particular, we see the almost lack of image in correspondence of checks. So, this difference for you is explainable from some point of view. Perhaps, as someone stated, could be noise due to the air, or not. This is my question.
The question is that there are some differences clearly between the infrared image and the visible image. And I think the answer that I have is that there's considerable difference in the quality of the cameras that were used to take this. In one case, in the visible, we have very high quality photographic film and cameras. In the case of the infrared imagery, it doesn't come even close to matching the resolution, so that's one difference. The other differences have to do, I think, with the film that was used to take the scope picture of the camera. And that's, and I frankly don't know anything about the linearity of that film. So that's a question. By the way, that's an issue for everybody to consider when they're looking at images, and make sure that they understand what they're looking at. Make sure they understand the so-called gamma of that film, if it's linear or very nonlinear. If it's very nonlinear, you're going to get artifact that really isn't there. So I don't understand the film and to take the picture that we show. And I also don't understand very well the optical characteristics of the camera that we used at the time. So these could both very easily account for the discrepancies that you are talking about. I don't see any reason to postulate that there's any fundamental difference because of the strong correlation of the visible image and the infrared image. They're correlated, in my view, very closely. There are differences. You can see that in the infrared case they're distorted and so forth, but there's a strong correlation between the two. Frankly, it's a correlation that I didn't expect, but was just jumped out at us, and so we're very pleased to have that result. I would not attribute any of those differences to anything fundamental. I hope that answers your question. Oh, yes, another question.
Okay, from a general point of view, there is a strong correlation. But if we go into details, there are differences that I think are quite interesting. For example, the lack of an image in the correspondence of A is not found in the visible image. In this case, if we suppose that the image was caused by a radiation, can we suppose that the radiation acted more in an area than another? So in the infrared, we are able to detect where the radiation acted more or less.
I don't think I would really offer any comment on that whatsoever. In terms of speculating about what processes caused the image in the first place and whether there is an attributable difference in the infrared image versus the visible image to some effect. Or to some cause, I'm sorry. And I would speculate. I would offer that up as a research project, however, to someone who wants to look into the differences between the infrared image and the visible images and see if there's really a structural difference there.
I have a question for Joe. Everybody does. My question is this. In your, albeit limited ability to get these infrared images, were you able to detect any differences between the infrared and the visible light images in the banding areas on either side of the face, which absolutely there is an effect of the banding on the image formation mechanism, because the dark bands that are on either side of the shroud's face have caused a lot of skeptics to say, well, it can't be real because the guy's face is too narrow. But all you need to do is a very simple little lightening of that banded area, and you'll see the rest of the cheek, the hairline, and the cheek line, which is absolutely on the shroud, but we never get to see it on these high contrast images because it always goes below the threshold. And so I'm curious whether you were able to see image in those banding areas, or whether you were not able to detect it, or whether it wasn't something you were able to see.
I think the answer is no. I didn't look. It's probably the simplest answer.
There was, and I don't remember which one it was, maybe one of you guys can tell me, there was one special test that we took that did reveal the fullness of the face. Do you remember which one that was?
Might have been Burns infrared.
It might have been Burns infrared, because I remember it was very exciting to see the full of the cheek.
Might have been the UV photos.
What he was talking about, when he says UV, he's talking about the shortwave infrared, the very low, right above the visible region of the spectrum, not the long wave, so there's a difference in. I would not really comment. I expect, from first principles, that I would expect a correlation simply because of the relationship between the reflectance and emissivity. There would be a strong correlation between the two images, period. Now, any differences that are noted between those two images, I would attribute to artifacts in the camera. First order, I would attribute to artifacts in the camera and other. You know, there is an issue in the infrared that I didn't talk about, is that slight variations in the cloth. You know, that the cloth was not necessarily stretched tight. Those little variations in angle, you know, the observation angle, will cause a difference in infrared received radiation, and that in itself could be the cause of the differences between the two. So right offhand, I'm not going to assign any phenomenological difference based on process to the differences between the two. I expect them to be correlated. They are largely correlated, and I'm just going to leave it at that. I offer it up as a research project to anybody who wants to look into it.
Joe, in your paper, you mentioned that you had illuminated or excited with 1,500 watt lamps that you bought from, or you borrowed from America.
Which actually I borrowed from a local Italian photographer.
Okay, my question, first of all, is did you front light it, back light it? How did you light it, front light it? Okay. And the second question is, did those have the thermal infrared or near infrared protection on the lamps where it doesn't project the heat forward? As far as you know, it did not.
Did not.
Okay, so it's not like a projector lamp.
Standard, no, they were standard quartz
Okay.
element.
Very good, thank you.
One other question that I have, maybe there was a videotape of the infrared, and I know because no one was available to hold the camera. So I held the camera, and what became of those? It was a videotape.
Are you talking about the same infrared that I'm talking about?
I assume, I don't know.
You and I are going to have to discuss this.
Thank you.
I've got a two-part question. It's not a scientific question at all. But I'd like each of short answer on both parts of the question from each if possible. And maybe it's a question basically that I used to be a federal prosecutor, and I asked this question of my investigators. This investigation's been going on for a good long while. We've had a lot of very intelligent people looking at it. So the question is basically, how far down the knowledge trail have we really come? Specifically, if 100% represents everything that's significant and knowable with today's science, do we know 95% in your opinion, or do we know 75% or 50%? And if you give if the percentage is fairly low in your mind, what specifically critical information is missing? What next do we need to do?
You want a short answer to that? What time does this place go? As far as the knowledge trail is concerned, my impression is it looks like we have just a huge amount of information. I brought the 1980 National Geographic down for some other questions that were being asked. But when I consider things that need to be retested, when I consider the lack of full spectrometry with modern instrumentation, when I consider the things that relate to X-ray like imagery. Please understand, I didn't say this was an X-ray. I said the X-ray like qualities within the image, which there are numerous ones, and the study of those relative to actual human anatomy. And then ultimately we need a spatial database so that we can correlate all this information, like a geographic information system. And what that means is if you go down to your local county assessor's office, they have access to a device called a geographic information system. And every spot on Earth has multiple layers of information in this database. So I can take a spot on the floor, and it belongs to so-and-so. It's in such and such a state, such and such a county, such and such a country. It's mounted over such and such a kind of turf, soils. There's wires buried under here. There's maybe gas that goes into the building. All of the things that talk about that one tiny spot on the face of this planet, they have information on. Now you bring it up on a computer, and it's a layered database. We need to do that with the Shroud of Turin, because otherwise you can't correlate all this information, all these things that Alan's coming up with, all these things that spectrometry shows, all the things that blood analysis shows, all the things from the different spectral signatures, all the things from the different years of photos. All of that needs to be correlated. And that requires a spatial database, like a geographic information system.
So what,
That was a short answer, by the way.
what percentage down the road are we on?
Answer the question.
I'm sorry, what?
Are we 80% there, are we 90% there, or where are we?
I'm going to give us about 1/10 of 1%. There's things that are going to surprise the heck out of us as we keep going.
I'll just have a short answer. Of all the things we could know, given unrestricted, caveat, put some constraints, of all the things we could know, given unrestricted access to the cloth, totally unrestricted, we could cut swatches out of it if we had. I'm being a little facetious. But frankly, that's, in my view, that may be the only way we're ever going to get down to the nitty-gritty. I think maybe we know about half of what we could know at this point.
Gee, thanks for quantifying that for me, Joe. You're far more qualified than I am. But I like what Pete was saying, and I guess we could call it Google Shroud. Because we can do that now online and look at virtually every square inch of the planet. Right? So I think it's a great idea. But as far as Larry's question goes, I think that it's rather arbitrary to try and put a number on it, Larry. Sorry. But I would go with the 50% because that's sort of right in the middle, and that sounds like a reasonable place.
It's a political leader, it's a nice waffle.
It is. But, diplomacy is very important in the world of the Shroud. So I'll just pass it to Karen.
My question would be to answer your question with a question. What is the purpose of quantifying it? In other words, what are you trying to get to by putting a number on it? Because if what you're trying to do is say, what is your decision about it, then we might be further down the road than if you're trying to say, what is the end result we can expect, if you follow what I'm saying. And by that I mean this. I long ago passed my threshold to believe that this is the real burial cloth. Okay? Period. Done. Long time ago. Do I think we know everything? No. If you read my abstract, I said I don't believe faith will ever allow us to find the so-called smoking gun, if you will, of syndenology. I don't think it's going to happen. But depending on unlimited access, as Joe just said, or what other testing we may do, hey, maybe we're 75% down the road. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. It's really hard to quantify.
I'm going to back up your question to 1978. When we left Turin, we knew thousands of times more about the Shroud than had ever been known before. 2 years later, when we met in Connecticut and saw what everybody had done with their data, we found out what we didn't know. We didn't know a whole lot more than we thought we didn't know. And so I won't quantify things, but I think my point being that further investigations, I'm getting closer to that goal of knowing everything, you're going to open doors that say, oh, wait a minute, I thought I was 90%, I'm back to 30% because I got this whole new field.
Different way to ask a question, briefly. Just like a lawyer.
By the way, you didn't see me, you can't prove anything.
In a criminal case, you have to know beyond reasonable doubt. That does not mean certainty, okay? In a civil case, you have to make it more likely than not. Okay, so each of you again, if you're going to be my witness, lots of questions. Whose side, which side would you rather be on, maybe? In a civil case, if the burden of proof is more likely than not, is it authentic is the first question, more likely than not. If we're in a criminal case, and the issue is not certainty, but beyond a very reasonable doubt, are you going to be, which side are you going to be on then? Is it the state of knowledge sufficient to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? Or is it just more likely than not? Or is it less likely than not in your individual judgment?
That's an easier one.
That's an easier question to answer.
That's an easier question to answer.
Well, it is for me.
Me too.
Good, go.
Just mess with it.
In a criminal case, if your witness or if the defendant, let's say, just suddenly stands up and says, I did it, well, that's, I confess. Well, that's the nail in the coffin. That doesn't necessarily imply that you know everything that there is to know about the whole situation, but that one thing puts you over the threshold, as radiocarbon dating could have put us over the threshold in that account. In other words, I'll go back to what I said earlier. Maybe we know 50% of everything we could know, but that one little fact, that one little radiocarbon dating was kind of sealed. Now we could, in terms of belief, yes or no, is it real or is it not? I mean, if we had a valid radiocarbon date, I think that would have answered that question, or at least it would help to answer the question. Now, there's still a lot of questions left about how it was formed and so forth, but if it's a 13th century object, then most of us would say, well, clearly it's not authentic, and maybe a bunch of other people would go on to continue to do the research and try to figure out what it is. It is a singular object, there's no question about it. But there's a difference between how much you can know and what the threshold of belief is, I guess is my point. And there are certain little elements that come up here that could come up, like radiocarbon dating, that would push everybody over the threshold very easily, yet not represent all of what we could possibly know.
Well, okay, the threshold of belief, I guess that's kind of where I'm going to go with this because, first of all, I'm not a scientist like some of these guys are, okay? I was an absolute total skeptic and expected to get to Turin and see the paint and the brush strokes and go home. And frankly, at age 32, I was thinking, wow, a free trip to Italy. That was about the extent of the depth I had about the Shroud of Turin. And it only took 17 years of studying the data and fortunately being close enough to the data itself that I had access to it. But it took 17 years for me to reach the threshold. And, I'm Jewish, so I didn't come into this kind of with any underlying emotion other than free trip to Italy. But I'm now convinced, based on my access to the data, including the radiocarbon dating, which was a big shock because I knew about the praying manuscript, which indicates the shroud existed at least 70 years earlier, that I have come to the conclusion that this is more than likely to be what it's purported to be. Now, I'm going to share a quick anecdote about my 85-year-old little Jewish mother, born in Poland, immigrated to Ellis Island. She finally heard, when Ken was there, we were back in Pittsburgh 4 years ago, I gave a shroud talk, we all did, and driving home, I asked my mother, what do you think? And she was very quiet. And then she turned to me and she said, well, of course it's authentic. Well, I'm shocked. This is a little 85-year-old Polish lady who, graduated from high school, not well-educated, and so I was baffled. And I asked her, well, why do you say that? And she looked at me in typical Jewish mother fashion, and she said, Barry, they wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years if it hadn't belonged to Jesus. I know there's a certain Jewish mother wisdom there. That's pretty amazing. And so now I tell that that story particularly to the Protestant, non-Catholic audiences I talk to because they seem to need to have a certain kind of external reinforcement to this. But to answer your question, I reached that threshold, frankly, when Al Adler explained to me personally why the blood was still red. That was the last thing that kept me from accepting that this could be the authentic artifact. And when Adler explained that, you know, the 30-some hours of torture, the breakdown of the red blood cells, the flooding of bilirubin into the bloodstream would keep the blood from ever turning dark, black or brown, that was sort of the last thing, because when Vern Miller and I stood side by side and the shroud was first laid in front of us, we looked at each other, we looked at the blood and went, that ain't real. So it took 17 years to get the answer to that, and that was sort of the last piece of the puzzle for me. So as far as threshold of acceptance, I reached that 13, 14 years ago.
I think it's pretty obvious where I stand if it's threshold of belief. How I reached it is maybe a little different than some of the other guys on the team, because I had to make myself step back from what I felt and believed in order to write the proceedings, in order to edit the reports, in order to meet on Good Morning America or whatever. I had to step back and say, okay, this is what we have to say because this is what we know. Having said that, you know, we used to have this little quip, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, it's a duck. Let's take it a little further. If it looks, swims, flies, has pin feathers like a duck, quacks like a duck, its mother was a duck, we're going to say it's a duck, but maybe we haven't found duck DNA yet.
I'm going to approach it a little differently. I'm going to look at different levels of the word authentic. First question is, do I believe it's authentic in terms of it's really a 2,000-year-old cloth and not a forgery of later time? And I'll say my personal belief on that is probably 98, 99%. Next question of authenticity, is it authentic in the sense that what's on the shroud is the image of a man who was crucified and tortured? My belief in that is 98, 99%. You look at that shroud closely, up front and personal, there is no question in your mind, nobody made this thing. And you don't judge that looking at photographs, you see the cloth in front of you. Okay, now you get to the last question, is that man Jesus Christ? Sorry, Ken, but ever the scientists prove things by disproving negative hypotheses, typically. They walk their way up the ladder and take a lot of wrong routes along the way. And
but when they get to the top, I'll be there waiting.
and so I've asked myself this question, and I've used this reasoning in a lot of shroud talks, and that is that as a scientist, watching more and more pieces fall into place, like Barry was talking about, my personal estimation of the probability that the man in the crowd shrouds Christ had crept up into the 92, 93% range. Then the carbon-14 came out, and I said, boy, you know, a lot of people are saying it went down to 0%. I said, no, you know, everything's not in yet, you know, so I'm going to say, in my mind, I fell back to low 80%. All right. Then when the carbon-14 got the issues with it were made public, I'm right back up there in the 92, 93% range. And the reason is I can always think of a scenario, and there are a lot of reasons why it doesn't quite fit, but 2 or 3 years later, the Roman guards are crucifying another guy, and one of them says, hey, let me tell you what we did to this guy in Jerusalem a couple of years ago. Let's do that again. That was fun. And you can't discount that possibility. So again, purely from not letting my spiritual side of me get into it, which is very plentiful, purely from my scientific side of my mind, that's the way I do it.
Pete's gonna go give a shot.
Go, Pete.
I guess I'm not used to hearing legal questions. Certainly, I think I said what I said in my talk. I'm putting my life on the line for it. Not just because of the Shroud of Turin, but the Shroud of Turin reads like a gospel. And if you don't see the gospel in those images, you're not paying attention. So I'd have to say, yeah, it's a slam dunk for me. I know which side I'm on. I'm going there. On the other hand, if I'm just going to investigate and I'm looking for the truth, and I've got two people that both want to know the truth, and one of them is kind of leaning one way and the other one's kind of leaning the other way, one has the deepest pockets, I'll work for him. Because I want to find the truth too. I didn't go into this with bias. I went into this totally ignorant of what it was. Totally ignorant of what Shroud was. And I haven't found anything to contradict that yet, save for one anomaly of carbon dating.
Yes, just another quick question. How many attempts have been made to duplicate the shroud? And to what extent did you see it reflecting the original? Just commenting off the top.
423.
I would venture to guess that at least in the last 20 years, I've probably seen all of them, however many that might be. For some reason, maybe the website or a higher profile that I've taken in the last 10 or 15 years, a lot of people send me their stuff. Look what we've created. And the funny part of it is that nobody even gets close. And I mean, I've had people like Emily Craig, a forensic anthropologist, came out with a paper a number of years ago. And, you know, I read it and I just went, my God, this is just totally impossible. But I started catching a lot of flack from people out there saying, oh, you don't have Emily Craig's material on your website. You're obviously afraid that she's gotten the answer and you don't want to admit it. And I probably got about 30 emails like that from around the world. So I called up Emily Craig and I said, Emily, I need to publish a paper. And she got permission from the journal and I reprinted the paper and I have not received one email regarding Emily Craig's theory once people got a chance to see it, read it, and look at the results. Because it would have created a result that was so unlike the shroud as to be totally incredible. The other thing is she made no attempt to account for the bloodstains on there, which, at least from the forensic experts, tell us that these are natural, legitimate blood flows, not painted there by some artist in the tomb in 2 hours. And I did point out to Emily, but she didn't seem to get it, that Jewish burial custom is such that on Friday night when the sun goes down and it's the Sabbath, that's it, no more work. So what artist would go into a tomb after the beginning of the Sabbath to paint an image of a guy who's dead there that wouldn't be violating the law to be the next person on the cross?
And it's the High Holy Day Sabbath, so, you know, the rabbis will really get up.
Yeah, so the answer to the question is countless numbers of attempts have been made. I've probably, like I said, in the last 20 years, seen most of them, maybe because I'm a photographer, they send them to me, and nothing has even come close. Not even close.
It was a Christian artist.
There were no Christians! Pardon me, Christian.
Well, there yet.
There were a few Italians in this area.
One of the things that when Barry was talking to me came to mind, and that is that all of the, shall we say, imitations, reproductions, however maybe we might want to call, concentrate, seems like, on the 3D aspect of the imaging. I mean, it's like, let's forget everything else that's there. And I mean, there's a huge amount of other stuff that's there. Okay? And the 3D aspect, I'm going to tell you right here, right now, it's not perfect 3D, folks. Because there's blood stains on top of the shroud and not image in 100% of the area. So when you see some of the distortions, when you look at the 3D aspect of the shroud, it's not perfect. And so part of the acid test in looking at somebody's attempt to make a shroud is to see if the distortions are equal, to see if the anomalies are equal, and they're not. And they never are. Not in any of the ones that I've done.
One more point, in all fairness to Emily Craig. Emily Craig spent 25 years as a medical illustrator before she became a forensic anthropologist. So her knowledge and skills of human anatomy are far superior to the average person. Emily Craig also studied the shroud quite extensively before she wrote her paper. And one of the things she figured out was how to create a similar effect of density at the higher points, darker image at the higher points that would have been in direct contact. She integrated that into her result, which moved her closer to a reasonably kind of accurate portrayal of what we see on the shroud. But all the other chemistry and physics were wrong. So you gotta, like I say, making images on women, easy. Making images with the same chemical and physical properties, good luck.
And if you really want an answer to, is it possible to create one of these things called the shroud, I don't think you can do better than Isabel Pisak. There's a little tiny lady who is a masterful artist in her own right and absolutely destroys with her paper any possibility that you can do this with a human hand, then goes on to write a paper on the physics of the shroud.
It's about 1:26. I think we'll end it there. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for that. That was very informative.